Civil libertarians. It's just right up my alley. Before I start, I just want to remind you all that the state Republican convention is just down the street. And I would venture to guess that it may be a little more entertaining than my few comments here. But more about the Republicans a little later. I'm going to try to make this relatively brief and perhaps open it up to some comments or some questions you all may have. You know, as I was starting looking for a piece of paper a couple of days ago in my office to make notes for today, I came across notes on my desk from a presentation I had made to the ACLU boards 17 years ago. Now, leaving aside the question why I would have 17-year-old notes on my desk, I want to quote what I wrote on those notes. Quote, "Cost of criminal justice system is monumental. State is in debt. Comes at expense of education, especially higher education, and social welfare programs." Notes indicated that I spoke about the ongoing anti-immigrant sentiments, including the upcoming Proposition 187 on the ballot, and the consequences of the bill that had just become effective that year, denying the undocumented the right to have driver's licenses. I also wrote that the ACLU legislative office was, quote, "the voice of rationality," that we did not represent a special interest, but we represented the interest represented by the Bill of Rights, and that our lobbying was a continual effort to seek a, quote, "just, fair, and equitable society." I also wrote how important the grassroots was, how our membership was to accomplishing the goals that we were trying to achieve, and quoted no other than Mickey Welsh's comment about how we, quote, "turn out everywhere." I was like, you know, when I read those notes, I thought maybe I should have just taped the speech. Whatever I actually did say to the boards, and I could be watching the basketball games right now, because the issues that we did 17 years ago, and I just picked that year because those happen to be the notes that would be on my desk, define a great part of our legislative work then and what we do today. The issues remain the same. The difficulties may be, the issues may be a little harder across the street, a little more complicated, but you know, what brings us here and what we do across the streets are always there, and that's why we're here. So, given where we were 17 years ago, where are we today? And the question is, really, where do I start? But let's start with what has in fact dominated the legislative debate in California for the last 4 or 5 years. And that is, of course, the fiscal crisis and the issues around the budget. The economic crisis has impacted everything that gets done around here. The cuts to education, social welfare programs, and all other things that government provide have been enormous, in the billions and billions of dollars the last few years. Just this year alone, there were $1.4 billion cuts to the higher education programs. It has, honestly, as a lobbyist here in Sacramento, not been a pleasant experience. But with crisis, as they say, comes opportunity for change. And by far, as you can see by the signs around here, the most obvious need for change and opportunity for smart cuts comes in our correction system. The past 17 years, if not more, have seen really an honest, abject failure to reform our criminal justice system, especially the adult system. Up to this year, there have been no real cuts to corrections. In fact, their budget has doubled in the last 10 years alone, even while, you know, the crime rate has decreased for the past 15 or so years. And as you undoubtedly know, we spend more in our correction systems than we do in our higher education system. In fact, you may not know this, but maybe you do, that the budget proposed by the governor this year, the initial budget proposed by the governor, actually was higher than the year before. That is in the midst of all the other cuts that were being put forth in terms of our $26 billion deficit. The actual budget proposed was higher. And to his credit, the reason it was higher is because for the last 6, 7, 8 years, what's been happening is the legislature presumes cuts, this and that cut to corrections when they really are unreal cuts. And so they claim that they've made a cut of $500 million or $1 billion to this or that. And of course, nothing is ever realized, and then the legislature has to backfill the money the following year. It's not that we haven't tried for reforms. It's not that there have been reports after reports indicating how reform can be accomplished and the ways to reduce spending in ways that will improve public safety. It's just that up to now, there has not been the political will. But as that old song says, times they are changing. I think we are beginning. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here and what we'll be doing tomorrow. I mean, the seeds of reform are being planted, and I am optimistic that change will happen. But as I said, and I've said many times, there's lots to be done. As you may know, one of our priorities this year is one of our 3 legislative priorities this year is to try to achieve smart cuts to corrections. I have been lobbying for a long time, and especially this year, lobbying specifically on the efforts to remove low-level offenders from state prison, move them to the locals, and in particular, trying to make the simple possession of drugs, a misdemeanor instead of felony. As you may know, we currently have, unbelievably, 9,500 people in state prisons for simple possession of drugs alone. We have 10,000 people in state prison for possession for sale of drugs, usually a small amount of drugs. If we simply made simple possession of drugs a misdemeanor, that alone would save $450 million to the state budget. Nothing new, you're aware of this, and I know you'll be talking more about this later on this afternoon. But in the context of that debate, I think it's important to know what's in fact happened here in the last 2 or 3 days. You maybe have read in the paper, because all you do read about in the paper is about what's happening with the budget, that part of the realignment effort, they call it, is to move a lot of the state services to the locals. The legislature did, in fact, after a lot of debate, pass a criminal realignment bill. The gist of that piece of legislation, well, let me step back. That piece of legislation is contingent on the passage of the supposed tax extension thing that is going to be on the ballot, or may not be on the ballot, but we'll see in June. But essentially that realignment piece, the criminal realignment piece, will move, the intent is to move low-level offenders from state prison to the locals. The idea, it is alleged that that process will in fact save up to $2 billion from the correctional system over 5 years and move up to 38,000 inmates from state prison to local facilities. Now, we have indicated in our lobbying that, of course, we don't want to just shift one system of mass incarceration to another system of mass incarceration. But with the intent, at least the intent of the legislation, is to come up with evidence-based programs at the local level by which lower-level offenders will have better access to alternative programs. And the reality is that these offenders who go to state prison now get nothing. Some of these serve very short periods of time. It's a rotating system, and that's why, in part, why it's so expensive. But just to give you a little flavor, getting even this piece of legislation through the process did not come easy. And as my friends in the Republican Party quoted on the floor, you know, telling the Democrats if they pass this bill that, you know, telling the public, you know, you all get a gun, buy a dog, and put an alarm system in, because if you pass this bill, then those are the consequences. And of course, you know, this piece of legislation has no sentencing reform, none whatsoever. It's essentially a shift from this to this, with the hopeful expectation that will start change in the system. You know, from our perspective, it argues even stronger for our need to reform sentencing. Because if the decision, if in fact this becomes law, then the logic of why we should be calling individuals who serve time at the local level or alternatives to incarceration felons is beyond me. You know, so that our push to make, in fact, some of these crimes, especially low-level drug crimes, lowering the sentences and have the impact so that sort of minimize the collateral impact of felony sentences on these offenders is even greater as far as I'm concerned. The cost to the counties, assuming this happens, will be less because the exposure of these individuals to the criminal justice system will be less. So it is a move in the right direction. It is a move in the right direction. It's the first significant change in the criminal justice system since the enactment of indeterminate sentencing, going to determinate sentencing back in the late 70s. So lots remains to be done, at least in this area. And since I do a lot of it, obviously not very successfully so far, I'm looking forward to the challenges. But you know, criminal justice is not the only thing we do around here, to say the least. As Mickey pointed out, we have a variety of other areas to get involved. I want to speak briefly to them: privacy, immigration, student rights, First Amendment. It goes on and on and on. The two that you guys will all be helping us with, hopefully you'll be hanging around and helping us with on Monday, are very important. One is Senator Yee's Reader Privacy Act. I don't know if we've had a little panel on that one yet, but that piece of legislation will protect readers' information by prohibiting sharing of information of the books you read without informed consent, and prohibits access by government to the books you read without a warrant or a court order. My understanding is that bill will, if enacted into law, will be the first such piece of legislation in the country. And what it speaks to, even more broadly than this particular piece, is just sort of the broader questions that I think maybe some of the panels have discussed, the issues of technology and the privacy, and how our privacy laws haven't caught up with sort of ever-expanding ability to incorporate personal information, easy access to that personal information. In that context, we are also, while it's not on your list of things to do, we're also very involved in a piece of legislation to overturn a recent Supreme Court decision, California Supreme Court decision, which said if you are arrested for anything, and you happen to have one of these nasty little things in your hand, these little things, the cops can now access it, all the information in your lovely little smartphone without a warrant. And so the implications of that are tremendous. And I even think the politicians will like it. Because, you know, politicians keep a lot of their personal information on these things. Aside from ourselves, you know, I mean, it's different than the old days, right? I mean, the court construed this as a container, sort of like a cigarette lighter. You know, so you can just open up a container, you can look at it. After you've been arrested, you have obviously less privacy rights after you've been arrested, so they can search you easier. But you know, just like it's the questions of now, sort of the reality of our technology and how we need to try to protect ourselves from overreaching by the government. Now, of course, the cops will not stop. You get arrested, will look in your thing. Of course, they won't do that. But just in case, you know, we do think they ought to get a warrant. So that's going to be one of the bills that we're going to do. I think that might be actually a lot of fun.